of a certain age, you know what's coming next. Forever associated with F1. Formula One, the rivals. F1's greatest, yes, goosebumps indeed. F1's greatest duels. Delve into Formula One's most iconic rivalries with stunning photography. Insight from celebrated F1 Tony Dodgens again. Delighted to be joining me live for a second time on the show. He must be mad. Anyway, delighted to have Tony back with us. Tony, welcome back to TRE.
Thank you very much.
So, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The people go, well, you know, the sport F1, it's getting a bit sort of sameish. It's always one team takes over for you know, and scoots away with the championship. But if you look back at the sport, it is littered with these heroic duels between two protagonists. I mean, people are talking now about obviously Verstappen v Hamilton, but I mean, Prost, Senna, Alonso, Schumacher, Mansell, Piquet. I mean, there's just so many that go back and back and back. Hamilton versus Rosberg. I mean, and that's before we go even further back into sort of the older era.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. It was going back to the late 60s that got me hooked on Formula One. I don't know if you remember, but you're probably not as old as me, but back in the day, we only used to get sort of 20 minutes of like Monaco, British Grand Prix, Italian Grand Prix, whatever. And I remember watching 69 Silverstone. Jackie Stewart and Jochen Rindt must have overtaken each other 30 times in that race. And I was only 8 years old, but I just couldn't believe what I was watching. And I thought, this is fantastic. And, I knew from that moment I wanted to be involved in.
And I mean, just going back to that, Stewart versus Rindt, and then it was Fittipaldi versus Stewart into that 70s thing. I mean, absolutely brilliant racing. And the battle is, I mean, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, motor racing was dangerous. I mean, it really was. And there was a respect, wasn't there, between drivers? I mean, there still is, I suppose.
I mean, yeah, completely. I mean, I remember talking to Jackie Stewart, and he was saying that he went to something like 57 racing funerals during his career. And, it was the kind of days where you were effectively driving a mobile incendiary bomb, and if you stuck somebody off the road into a barrier, chances are they'd catch fire.
Yeah, I seem to remember that famous duel that you talk about between Rindt and Stewart. And didn't Stewart actually say to Rindt, "Look, I've signalled you've got a flat tyre. You better pull in because."
He absolutely did. Yeah, they had they were mates as well. They sort of lived on different hills in Switzerland, I think. But Jackie noticed that I think Jochen's wing was collapsing and it was fouling the tyre, and he had a puncture. So he just pointed at the tyre and warned him, basically.
So let's start off though with, if you like, the first one of the modern era, and talk about opposites, but really great mates in real life. So great they made a film out of it. Of course, Hunt v Lauda. Now that was I was an 8-year-old boy in '76, so I remember being absolutely transfixed by this.
So I was 16, and I was as well 15, and I was absolutely transfixed as well. I was a huge Lauda fan, and of course the British nation all got behind Hunt. And I don't know why I was a Lauda fan. I think it was probably something to do with Ferrari and liking Ferraris. And I think he took sort of 9 poles each, 74, 5, and the championship 75. And then Hunt came along. He got that break when Emerson went to drive the Copasuca, if you remember that. Yep. So James got this thing, and he was like the dashing British hero, wasn't he? And it just captured the imagination. That was the duel that took, I'd say, Formula One from the back pages of the paper to the front.
I mean, British Grand Prix 1976, that, Regazzoni and Lauda, and proving that 2 into 1 don't go, and Hunt going fly. And there was almost a riot, wasn't there? It's the summer of 76. It's that summer, the hot summer. And this was like the flashpoint, if you like.
It was the baking hot summer, and it was, Hunt trying to win that race in front of the British fans, and suddenly British fans told that he wasn't allowed to take the restart after getting involved in the shenanigans at the first corner. So they, as you say, they were going mad. They were lobbing empty beer cans onto the track, then full beer cans onto the track, and it was just, and he eventually did start and, past Nicky, won that race, and then subsequently got disqualified.
And it would have been a duel. It would have been worthy of inclusion in the book anyway. But of course, then we get Nürburgring and the crash that very nearly kills Niki Lauda, and the comeback is just. I mean, if you were a Niki Lauda fan before, then but ye gods, his recovery was nothing short of miraculous.
Totally. I mean, I remember. He drove, I think, in the Italian Grand Prix, something like 39, 40 days after the Nürburgring accident, in which he'd been given the last rites. And, he inhaled lots of, burning plastic for the bodywork and everything. And, he had supposedly, not enough oxygen to sustain life. And there he was, 6 weeks later, driving in the Italian Grand Prix, which was unbelievable. I remember. You remember old Harry Carpenter?
But of course.
I remember him doing an interview and saying, that's one of the bravest men I've had the privilege of speaking to.
There's a photograph knocking around somewhere with him, and it's in the wet, and it must be a practice in Monza, and he's looking down, the main straight there, and the blood is. When they had to cut the bandage off his head at the end of it because and it's just. I mean, people talk about a heroic act, or a footballer is brave for taking a penalty, but my goodness. That redefined it. And of course, the end was pure grandstand. I mean, they made a film out of it, didn't they? But I mean, even more incredible in real life.
Yeah, I mean, that last race in Japan where, I mean, Lauda actually got quite a bit of flack from, packing in after the opening lap because it was absolutely teeming with rain. They probably should never have started it, but of course the TV schedules dictated that, this was going to happen. They did actually start it. Nicky stopped, along with, I think, Emerson Fittipaldi and someone else who also decided that, he was crazy. And part of Lauda's problem was that in the accident, he'd had his eyelids burnt and he couldn't actually blink away the tears. So, when you had mist and spray, his problems were twofold.
But, Hunt Hunt gets a puncture. He wins by a single point. He doesn't realise when he comes into the pits either. He thinks he thought he'd come fifth and he needed to come fourth to get the victory. So that was the one there.
Yeah, you couldn't have made, if you'd scripted that, you'd have been laughed out of court, I think.
Let's move to the ones of the modern era. Let's have a little warm up because I said that most racing drivers actually, quite like each other. Nige and Senna, not Senna, and Piquet, excuse me. Here was a case of two teammates really not getting on.
Yeah, this was amazing because basically I think Piquet signed as he was replacing Keke Rosberg, who was leaving the team, and Keke was the '82 world champion. Piquet had 2 titles under his belt when he signed, and he thought he was signing to be the Williams number one. And then, of course, Nige has a fantastic 85 season, wins the last, wins at Brands, wins another race, and all of a sudden he's a race winner. And I don't think it was actually written down. Piquet claims that Frank had given him a verbal agreement that he was number one. And then, of course, Frank had his accident at the pre-season test. And it was kind of never actually... other than, I think, Nelson having, first call on the spare car, it was never actually written in a contract that he was actually number one. So they had a problem initially, and then I think Nelson said some derogatory things about both Nigel and his wife.
Oh, did he ever?
Probably, given their respective sizes, was actually quite brave, I would have thought. But
well, yeah, because Nigel could quite pick him up and throw him into into free practice too, couldn't he? Basically,
absolutely.
But if you're looking at two different sides, we've got the Brazilian, thinks he's a bit of a ladies' man, an interesting driving style. I mean, a great driver. I mean, that pass around the outside of Senna Estoril is worth it alone. And then Mansell goes and does it at Silverstone at Copse, and the place just explodes.
Yeah, no, that was. I mean, there were great drives at the British Grand Prix by Mansell in both '86 and '87, and he got the better of Piquet both times. I mean, that Silverstone race, where he passed, he sort of made an extra stop, hunted him down, dummied him, passed him at the inside at Stowe, and it was just, the whole place went mad. It was just, it was fantastic. And you got to say, Nige got the better of him.
Yeah, but and also, that great sort of British motor racing public, because the British public do know their motor racing, so they could appreciate what was going on. It wasn't sort of knuckle dragging, was it?
No, it wasn't. And I mean, even later, when he went back there in 92, when he won his championship in 92, I mean, the Williams, the 14B was the class of the field by a mile. And I think he was something like, but he was 2 seconds faster than Riccardo Patrese in the same car, and Patrese just shook his head and gestured about the size of his sphericals, I think, and just couldn't believe that he'd done that time. He was like 2 seconds faster than Ricciardo and 3 seconds faster than Senna's McLaren, I think he was,
Unbelievable. Let's talk about Schumacher, shall we? Because I've been given a list, and the first three on the list are Hakkinen versus Schumacher, Hill versus Schumacher, Alonso versus Schumacher. I mean, driving style, the Kaiser, imperious, to put it mildly. Any length to win, you could say. I mean, everybody had a problem, didn't they? Or everybody had a Titanic duel, which just goes to show that what a fantastic driver he was. Yeah, he was. He was. Some will argue that Hakkinen was actually quicker over a lap, but the whole package, definitely Schumacher was superior. He put everything into it. He took training to a new level. He took diet to a different level. He would say that over race distance, he would drive probably within 99% of, the optimum for the whole race. And that was difficult to contend with. And he was also ruthless. I mean, we saw what happened with Hill at Adelaide in 94. We saw what happened with Jack in Jerez 97, and then he parked the bus at Raskas in 2006, so he would go to, as you say, any lengths, and including putting his brother almost into the pit wall at Monaco, and what he did to Rubens in Hungary was just, poor. But I think, by that stage, there were people having sort of big accidents, safety come on, even though, we lost Ayrton in the year that Michael won his first title. But, safety had come on. I think there wasn't quite the respect that there had been in the 60s and 70s. People would be put in compromising situations, and it just became more or less normal. If you think about the accident at Spa at the start, when Coulthard goes sideways and then everybody plows into him, and everybody walks away from that. And if that had happened, heaven forfend, in the 60s or the 70s, well, we saw what happened to Ronnie Peterson at Monza. Imagine even had a fireball. Exactly. In the 70s. That's I think that was the difference. They realised things had changed, and they took advantage of that. Now, one might argue that has had a detrimental effect, because our current world champion, some will say his driving skill is aggressive and it is a bit sort of PlayStation-ish and bounce off. Now, I know he's a brilliant driver, but do you think, and also the way that some of the media report, they make it these almost like these boxing matches, and at the end of the day, you've got people flying around circuits at, close to pulling sort of whatever G's, and it's you have to be careful, you have to have some respect. There can't be too much hype. No, I mean that's true, but I think when you talk about Max, it's nothing new, because we just talked about Michael driving like that, Senna drove like that, and Lewis is interesting because he's got a reputation as a very fair, even-handed driver, and that's largely true. But he also knows exactly where to position a car, and he doesn't really take prisoners either. But it appears less aggressive than it does, say, from Max. It's very interesting about the way that but then again, he is now the elder statesman of the sport, and it sounds strange to say that, but so he is the guy who should have all, like Jack Brabham was racing in 1970, he should have all the tricks up his sleeve. One of the races that we lost this year, who'd retired, who's had a renaissance, Vettel, but people forget about because Vettel wasn't liked. I mean, now he's become especially as he was his farewell tour year, it was like, Seb, he's such a lovely guy. But he was very much portrayed in the Schumacher mode, and he had some almighty scraps with Hamilton, and also with the gentleman who wrote the Ford to your book. Absolutely, with Mark, and that 2010 season was a fantastic effort by Mark, I thought. Because he sort of almost got a Chris Amon type reputation for bad luck.
been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then just as he gets into an Adrian Newey car, he breaks his leg. So 2009, he wasn't the real mark. 2010, he was back and could have won that title. But, he had the thing in Turkey with Seb and a couple of incidents, of course, Multi-21 3 years later where, supposedly there was an agreement they should finish in the order and Seb ignored it. So, I feel very sorry for Mark missing out on 2010. I think he probably deserved that on balance, but, Abu Dhabi, the last one, didn't work for him.
Yeah, but I mean, a brilliant racer, sports cars as well, and a great guy. I mean, Aussie grit, quote unquote.
Yeah, no, fantastic guy. And if ever you wanted, pure common sense and a quote, and he wouldn't shy away from it, he was your man.
Was he quite okay to write the Ford for the? Well, obviously, it was because he did it. But obviously, we're looking at a competition where basically Vettel did kind of walk away with the championship, and Mark didn't.
No, he was fine about it because he's a sports enthusiast at the end of the day. You'll see him sitting watching Nadal Djokovic at the Aussie Open at the start of the year. He loves sport, what it means, rivalries. And so he's happy to acknowledge that, more than happy.
Just want to touch on two more because they are important, and we'll do the tragic one first, which is Villeneuve and Pironi, which again, if you wrote a Hollywood movie, it would be rejected. But that was the 82 season was absolutely tragic. And, Villeneuve was Villeneuve, wasn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, he was another great hero of mine, actually, and used to have a Villeneuve sticker on the back of my MGB GT. How about that? So, but he was spectacular. He was one of Enzo Ferrari's most revered drivers. And then they have this, this thing with Pironi. As you say, you could not have made that 82 season up either, and when that Imola race happened, I mean, it's interesting because I interviewed Pironi, I think back in 86.
Right. And
he said that was the race that the FOCA teams had boycotted it. And there was only 14 cars in the race. It was basically going to be Renault v Ferrari. And he claims they had a meeting in Prost's motorhome that the team managers didn't know anything about and said they'd put on a show for the crowd and that they'd, pass and repass each other. And then at half distance, they would make sure they were in grid order and the race would begin then. So he claims that Ferrari weren't any longer marginal on fuel, which is what Gilles has always said. And I'm sure you remember, the column that Nigel Roebuck wrote, the journalist. He was Gilles' friend and colleague. And Gilles said basically he was trying to slow it down the whole time. And Didier just, disregarded the order, which was basically a slow sign. When Gilles was in front. So it was tragic in that they never spoke after that. And then out went Gilles in Belgium, a tenth of a second behind, one run left, and crashed fatally.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the brightest lights and brightest times goes. And then, of course, Pironi breaks his legs. Is it Hockenheim or Brands Hatch?
I'm in practice over the back of Prost Renault, yeah.
Yeah, and then, of course, dies in a motorboat accident. And just awful. It goes to show that, it is a dangerous sport. And I thought we'd save the most iconic till last because we have this huge list of great Prost v Lauda, as I said before, Alonso v Schumacher, but Prost Senna. What can you say? I mean, through one for the ages, huh?
Oh, fantastic! And it was, Alan at the time was seen as the man when Ayrton joined McLaren. Pardon me. And basically, it was a case of Alan agreeing to take him on in the same team. And then he finds that Ayrton's blindingly quick, couldn't believe how quick he was. And he said that to Joe Ramirez, who was the team coordinator, a friend of both. And he said, F, this guy is quick, and he said it in the motorhome. And Joe said, I knew then that Ayrton was halfway there. And, Ayrton was definitely quicker, but they emerged with a title apiece because in 89 he had a lot of unreliability and breakdowns. And, they had the on-track clashes, even at McLaren. And then, of course, Alan goes to Ferrari. Ayrton runs him off the road in Japan to get even. And you couldn't make that story up either.
And again, it was two entirely different personalities, wasn't it? It was the professor against Senna, who's done which is called the lap of the gods at Monaco, and he says he's in a tunnel. And also because they were just so temperamentally different, and it made huge. I mean, that really put F1 on the calendar, didn't it?
That was total box office, and I think even it ran even to the end of '93 when Alan had the superior car. He had the Williams in '93, and Ayrton had a Cosworth-powered McLaren. And McLaren improved the car over the season. And then the last two races of '93, Alan had already announced his retirement in Portugal because Frank had signed Ayrton for '94, and he just didn't. I don't think he could stomach going up against him again in the same car. And in the last two races of '93. I remember it so well. I mean, Ayrton drove out of his skin to win Suzuka and Adelaide. And, he won his last two races against Prost. And, they stood on the podium. And then that night in Adelaide, and, there was a Tina Turner concert, Simply the Best and everything. And he had him up on stage. She had him up on stage and everything. And it was, it was the last time they competed against each other, apart from the karting event at Bercy in Paris, and it sort of thawed between the two of them just before Ayrton had his fatal accident.
Yeah,
they'd spoken and agreed to try and do some things to improve the safety.
Yeah, the great what ifs, isn't it? I mean, when it comes to whittling this down, obviously there are some amazing pictures in this as well. So it must have been a great work to actually put it down and into paper, and also to pick out the images or to be consulted with the images for it.
No, it was great fun to do, actually, and some of the photography in the book is absolutely stunning. So. I think it just brings back so many memories just leafing through it. Some great.
If only we could. It was an audio, but you could get the sound, because that's what I miss most about the F1. It's the sound of full chat going down Hanger Straight in the wet.
Yeah, no, I agree, but. You can't have everything, so.
But you can try. You can try.
You've got to make some great pictures, and I'm not going to comment on the words.
The book is called Formula One: The Rivals, F1's Greatest Duels. It's by Tony Dodgens, who we speaking to again, and it's got a foreword by Mark Webber. If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
I'm at Tony Dodgens is my Twitter handle. And I don't really do social media. I've got to say, I'm too much of a dinosaur. But there you go.
If you keep popping up, if you keep producing books like this, Tony, it's not a bad thing to do. The book is called The Rivals. It's by Tony Dodgens. Tony, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you, Giles. Cheers.